Kalorama, a Recorded Books hybrid imprint, presents The Language of Climate Politics, Fossil Fuel Propaganda and How to Fight It, by Genevieve Guenther. Read by Genevieve Guenther. For Teddy. The problem in democratic societies lies in figuring out which apparently non-propagandistic claims are in fact propaganda. Jason Stanley, How Propaganda Works. To clarify thought, to discredit the intrinsically meaningless words, and to define the use of others by precise analysis, to do this, strange though it may appear, might be a way of saving human lives. Simone Weil, The Power of Words. Now is the time to speak clearly. Greta Thunberg, No one is too small to make a difference. Preface. We. It feels perfectly natural to use the word we when you talk about climate change. We are causing climate change. We are emitting more carbon dioxide than ever. We need to draw emissions down to net zero in order to halt global heating at the Paris Agreement target of well below 2 degrees Celsius. Given that human beings are, in fact, causing climate change, the impulse to use the word we makes sense. But there's a real problem with it. The guilty collective it invokes simply doesn't exist. The we responsible for climate change is a fictional construct, one that's distorting and dangerous. By hiding who's really responsible for the crisis, the word we provides political cover for the people who are happy to destroy a livable climate to gain more profit and power. Let's think about it. Who is this we? Does it include the nearly 700 million people who live on less than $2.15 a day? Does it include the approximately 4.2 billion people, half the global population, who live on less than $6.85 a day? Does it include the millions of people all over the world, like the 6 million who participated in the global climate strikes of September 2019, doing whatever they can to lower their own emissions and push for systemic change? Does it include Bill McKibben, the elder statesman of the climate movement who wrote his first book about climate change in 1989? How about Greta Thunberg, the young woman who inspired worldwide climate protests by sitting in front of the Swedish parliament every Friday to demand her government take action at the scale of the crisis? Does it include the indigenous people who have been living in harmony with their ecosystems for generations? Does it include our children? Of course the universal we seems real. The fossil fuel system, for the moment, feels all-encompassing. It provides the means for what people do on this planet. In its inclusions and exclusions, its laying out the conditions for human action, it seems totalizing, especially from an affluent American vantage point. But it's not totalizing, and it's certainly not eternal. It requires active reproduction at every moment in time, through subsidies, through construction and repair of its infrastructure, through court cases that uphold its laws, through protection of its so-called assets by the military, through Instagram photos that pretend its benefits will bring you joy, and on and on. Instead of thinking of climate change as something we are doing, always remember that there are millions, possibly billions of people on this planet who would rather preserve civilization than destroy it with climate breakdown, who would rather have the fossil fuel economy end than continue. Those people are not all mobilized by any means, but they are there. But remember, too, that there are millions of other people, some of them running the world, who seem willing to destroy civilization and allow untold numbers of people to die in the decades ahead so that the fossil fuel system can continue now. Remember as well that there are degrees of complicity. Without structural changes paid for collectively, most of us have no alternative but to use fossil fuels to some extent. Each of us can only do our best. And lots of people, including, as you shall learn, Some climate researchers, policymakers, and even advocates believe, mistakenly, that the world can keep using coal, oil, and methane gas and still halt global heating anyway. But neither constrained choices nor mistaken beliefs are akin to the deep and shameful complicity of, for example, those in public relations who create advertising campaigns for oil and gas companies, or those in the news media who refuse to mention climate change or the dangers of fossil fuels in their reporting. Such people are making money destroying the world. Complicit people and institutions must be called out and encouraged to change. And the fossil fuel industry must be fought. And the governments that support that industry must be replaced. But none of us will be effective in this if we think of climate change as something we are doing. To think of climate change as something that we are doing, instead of something that we are being prevented from undoing, perpetuates the very ideology of the fossil fuel economy we're trying to transform. Fossil fuel ideology can be reproduced even by a tiny, innocuous pronoun like we. This capacity to transmit ideologies, to shape the way people see the world without their even being aware, makes words politically powerful. To undo climate change, a new collective we, me, you, everyone who listens to this book, everyone with whom we share its ideas, will need to use the power of words to fight climate propaganda and transform the deep ideologies of the fossil fuel economy. Contributing to that transformation is the goal of this book. Introduction: Why Words Matter in Climate Politics. Political ground is gained not when you successfully inhabit the middle ground, but when you successfully impose your framing as the common sense position. George Lakoff, University of California, Berkeley. Conservatives don't follow the polls. They want to change them. Climate change is a hoax, Donald Trump sneers using his best wise guy accent. This is the kind of lie that most people associate with fossil fuel propaganda. And for good reason. Since at least the 1970s, coal, oil, and gas companies have known that their products would cause the planet to heat up, undermining the climate that enabled civilization to flourish over the past 10,000 years. To cover up what they knew, these companies worked with political strategists, advocacy organizations, think tanks, trade associations, and advertising firms to hone and spin the message that climate change wasn't real. By the time the U.S. Congress first attempted to take major climate action with the 2009 cap-and-trade emissions bill that died in the Senate, this fossil fuel propaganda had become the Republican Party line. It remains the party line, at least for the MAGA base. In the first Republican primary debate of the 2024 election, entrepreneurial candidate Vivek Ramaswamy, perhaps gunning to become Trump's vice presidential pick, declared that, quote, "The climate change agenda is a hoax. The reality is," Ramaswamy added, "more people are dying of bad climate change policies than they are of actual climate change." For this latter claim, he offered no evidence, of course. As absurd as it is to say that climate change policies are killing people, it is equally absurd at this point to claim that climate change isn't real. The planet is over 1.3 degrees Celsius hotter on average than it was in the pre-industrial era. Its temperature is rising at a rate of around 0.2 degrees per decade. Land maximum temperatures are rising twice as fast, to over 1.7 degrees already. Every summer, a ghastly parade of stories about deadly extreme weather marches across the news, and scientists are now able to attribute this weather to climate change. In 2015, over 195 nations signed the Paris Agreement, pledging to halt global warming at 1.5 degrees or, at worst, well below 2 degrees Celsius. By the end of 2022, 79% of global emissions were covered by net zero targets. Net zero is the point where emissions are virtually eliminated, and any unavoidable climate pollution left over is taken out of the atmosphere by carbon removal. Trump and his acolytes are perfectly willing to dismiss all this, telling people to reject the evidence of their own eyes and ears. But other fossil fuel interests, Republicans without Trump's authoritarian charisma, titans of finance and tech, fossil energy-funded researchers at elite universities, conservative media magnates, and, strikingly, coal, oil, and gas executives themselves, have started spreading a new, more subtle form of propaganda, which acknowledges that climate change is real, but still seeks to justify continuing the fossil fuel economy. This propaganda is spun out of 6 key terms that dominate the language of climate politics: alarmist, cost, growth, India and China, innovation, and resilience. Together, these terms weave a narrative that goes something like this. Yes, climate change is real, but calling it an existential threat is just alarmist. And anyway, phasing out coal, oil, and gas would cost us too much. Human flourishing relies on the economic growth enabled by fossil fuels, so we need to keep using them and deal with climate change by fostering technological innovation and increasing our resilience. Besides, America should not act unilaterally on the climate crisis while emissions are rising in India and China. This narrative is designed to foment the incorrect and dangerous belief that the world does not need essentially to stop using fossil fuels, either because climate change won't be that destructive, or in some versions of the story, because the world can keep using coal, oil, and gas and still halt global heating anyway. It would be bad enough if this narrative was being repeated only on the right. But what gives this narrative its power over current climate politics is that it's repeated in echoes and fragments, and sometimes in its entirety, by people on both sides of the supposedly partisan climate change divide. Not only by fossil energy interests, but also by scientists, economists, journalists, politicians, and sometimes even activists, all of whom sincerely intend to advance climate solutions. But that's because, as we shall learn, these terms and the ideas they convey have been appropriated from language produced over the decades by these climate groups themselves. Fossil energy interests have mined the language of climate advocates for material they can use for propaganda purposes, extracting, twisting, and deploying their words to entrap those advocates into unwittingly normalizing fossil fuel disinformation. This dynamic turns fossil fuel propaganda into a bipartisan consensus, the common sense position. We can see how this dynamic plays out by looking at the word uncertainty. As the Harvard historian of science Naomi Oreskes showed in Merchants of Doubt, fossil fuel partisans created doubt about the reality of climate change by talking incessantly about scientific uncertainty in their public statements about global heating. And for decades, this strategy worked. They were able to use the word uncertainty so effectively, in part because they exploited the word's cultural ambiguity, a quality that arises when a word means one thing to one group of people in a particular subculture, but another thing to the general public. So most people understand uncertainty to mean something like not knowing for sure or not having concluded yet. Scientists sometimes use the word in this way too, of course, but not always. When climate scientists speak of the uncertainty of their findings, they usually refer to the range of possible outcomes they can project with confidence. Indeed, uncertainty and confidence are actually synonyms in scientific discourse. Scientists can say either that a model produces an uncertainty interval or that it produces a confidence interval. And those intervals do not indicate either it happens or it doesn't. Rather, they span everything that could possibly happen, from the best to the worst case outcomes. So when scientists were being the most scrupulous in their communications about the climate crisis, trying to give the public a full sense of what they confidently knew at the time, they unwittingly echoed the message that there was some, quote, uncertainty that meant they weren't sure if climate change were real. In a truly fiendish act of appropriation, fossil fuel interests managed to recruit scientists into inadvertently spreading doubt. Although oil and gas interests no longer produce disinformation, by manipulating the ambiguities of the word uncertainty, they still use this technique of linguistic appropriation to shape the new 21st century propaganda that says, falsely, that phasing out fossil fuels would be worse than climate change itself. But let's be clear. Both the International Energy Agency and the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, have stated unequivocally that in order to achieve net zero emissions in time to halt global heating at a relatively safe level, the development of new oil and gas fields must cease immediately. Both have also stated unequivocally that to have even a 50-50 chance to halt global heating at the Paris target of 1.5 degrees Celsius, existing fossil energy infrastructure must be retired before the end of its expected lifetime. And fossil energy producers know this. A 2023 energy security scenario released by Shell, for example, saw the immediate end to growth in oil and gas production in models that kept heating below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Yet the American right wing continues its unequivocal support for expanding coal, oil, and methane gas. This isn't that complicated, guys, Ramaswamy said at the 2024 primary debate. Unlock American energy, drill, frack, burn coal. And Republicans do not just support fossil energy. As we shall see throughout this book, they consistently obstruct, or if need be, reverse, any legislative, executive, private sector, or cultural support for climate-safe energy. In the summer of 2023, then the hottest summer in human history, over 400 conservative analysts and former Trump administration officials, organized by the Heritage Foundation, the think tank that has shaped GOP policy since the Reagan administration, released a 920-page plan to dismantle most of the federal government's capacity to help fight climate change. Called Project 2025, the plan details how officials could shutter the Energy Department's renewable energy offices, prevent states from adopting California's car pollution standards, block the expansion of the electrical grid for wind and solar energy, and task Republican state officers with the oversight, such as it would be, of the fossil fuel industry. The timeline in this plan begins on day one of a Republican presidency. The Democrats have a much more ambivalent relationship with fossil fuels. In his first term, President Biden was perhaps the best climate advocate the White House had ever seen. And with the slimmest of Democratic majorities in the Senate, he managed to shepherd through two major pieces of climate legislation. The 2021 Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act invested in transmission and power grid upgrades and provided grants for electric vehicle infrastructure deployment, as well as the research and development of nascent technologies like direct air capture and green hydrogen. And the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act made major investments in utility-scale and distributed solar, wind, and other renewable resources, along with carbon capture facilities in the power and industrial sectors, and it provided uncapped tax credits for the purchase of electric vehicles, heat pumps, and other clean energy consumer products, along with yet more support for direct air capture and green hydrogen. At the same time, however, in the first 2 years of Biden's presidency, his administration approved more permits for oil and gas drilling on public lands than had even his climate-denying predecessor. The United States was already the world's biggest oil and gas producer and one of the biggest fossil fuel exporters. Yet in 2021, U.S. methane gas production increased by 2%. In mid-2022, the U.S. Energy Information Administration, EIA, projected production would increase by 3% that year, and an additional 2% in 2023. The EIA expected that crude oil production would increase by 6% in 2022 and 5% in 2023. As of January 2024, the EIA saw U.S. methane gas and crude oil production rising through 2025 to, quote, new records. Major emitters are supposed to be halting new projects and phasing out fossil fuel infrastructure. Even under Biden, the United States has been doing the opposite. One analysis found that the United States is poised to be the world's largest expander of oil and gas extraction between 2023 and 2050. What this means realistically is that if they are not changed, America's current climate politics, even under a Democratic president leading a Democratic Congress, will lead to the planet heating up beyond the Paris targets. In 2022, the United Nations Environment Program found that the legislative and executive actions already in place across the world would likely lead to 2.8 degrees Celsius of heating by 2100, with a confidence interval of 1.9 to 3.3 degrees Celsius. Scientists have called 3 degrees of warming a catastrophic outcome. The year 2100 may seem like a long time away, but it isn't. My own son was born in 2010. His life will play out across this century, when the world will either halt global heating at a manageable level or unravel. All this is no longer about future generations, but the families we have in our homes today. As the IPCC said in its 2023 report, quote, any further delay in concerted global action will miss a brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. To secure a livable future, one thing we will need to do is dismantle and reframe the terms dominating the language of climate politics. This is a key element of the political work to do now. Vast majorities of Americans support getting emissions to net zero. A large 2022 Pew Research poll found that 69% of Americans favor the United States becoming carbon neutral by 2050. But only a fraction of Americans support phasing out fossil fuels entirely. A mere 31% say that the United States should completely phase out coal, oil, and methane gas, according to a 2023 poll, while 68% say the country should use a mix of energy sources, including fossil fuels. These numbers are skewed by partisanship, of course, since only 12% of Republican voters support a fossil fuel phase-out. But still, only a minority of Democrats, 48%, support running the economy on 100% climate-safe energy. Fossil energy propaganda profoundly influences the political views of this muddled middle and the elites who represent them. I'll reveal how it does so by telling the stories of the main players in climate politics. The world-renowned climate scientists intimidated into downplaying the dangers of global heating by decades of relentless attacks on their reputations. The Ivy League economists celebrated by both the Nobel Prize Committee and fossil fuel front groups. The carbon management lobbyists appointed to the Department of Energy by the Biden administration, and the Democratic and authoritarian leaders colluding behind closed doors at high-level international climate negotiations. What these people say about fossil fuels and the climate crisis circulates through many platforms high and low. Scientific reports, policy briefings, political speeches, press conference transcripts, economics papers, academic and popular books about climate change, court cases, internal corporate and interest group memos, oil and gas advertisements, debate transcripts, social media posts, climate negotiation decision texts, and, not least, news media reporting. By following the key words of climate politics across these platforms, you will learn to recognize the mechanisms behind oil and gas interests' newest propaganda. You will learn how staunch opponents and ambivalent advocates of climate action reinforce each other's messages and reaffirm fossil fuel ideologies. And through this analysis, you will be introduced to new ways to talk about the climate crisis. Message tested in focus group polls commissioned by my organization, End Climate Silence. This new language will be hard for fossil fuel interests to appropriate, and, crucially, it will keep the phase-out of fossil fuels at the center of the climate change agenda. Of course, talking alone won't halt global warming. But, as they say on the right, ideas have consequences. Insofar as words shape ideas and ideas influence actions, we will need to transform the language of climate politics just as we need to transform the more material ways our politics supports the fossil fuel economy. We will need to speak with the rhetorical strategies of our opponents in mind so we can stop echoing their language and normalizing their propaganda. For there is no reason to normalize the false beliefs of the fossil fuel economy, to proceed as if the world couldn't be otherwise. The world can be otherwise. What follows will enable us to start talking about that new world and help bring it into being. Chapter 1, Alarmist. Warming substantially larger than the assessed very likely range of future warming cannot be ruled out. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Climate Change 2021, The Physical Science Basis. I have been surprised and alarmed at the record temperatures and floods we have seen in many places around the world, with only 1.1 degrees Celsius warming. Sir Brian Hoskins, Imperial College London, The Royal Society. Why scientists are using the word scary over the climate crisis. Climatic changes would, however, most impact humans. Civilization could prove a fragile thing. Shell, PLC. Confidential Group Planning Scenarios, PL 89 SO1, October 1989. A favorite propaganda tactic of fossil fuel interests is to call people who speak out about climate change alarmists. To call someone an alarmist is to accuse them of being an unreliable narrator, a person who cannot be trusted to tell the truth about global heating, either because they are too emotionally unstable, or, conversely, because they cunningly exaggerate the dangers of heating in order to frighten people into accepting their preferred policies. Fossil energy spokespeople use this tactic not only against climate activists trying to build public support for clean energy, but also against scientists simply reporting the results of their research. So, for example, analysts at the American Enterprise Institute, a conservative think tank whose funders have included ExxonMobil, Koch Foundations, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, have argued that there is, quote, no evidence that a climate crisis looms in our future, and that the reports of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, are nothing more than, quote, unfounded alarmism. Mocking climate alarmists for supposedly warning that, quote, the world has only 1 year, 2 years, 10 years, and so on to substantially reduce fossil fuel consumption, or else it will be too late to prevent multitudes of cascading global disasters that will make the biblical plagues of Egypt pale in comparison. The director of the Arthur B. Robinson Center on Climate and Environmental Policy at the Heartland Institute, another prominent right-wing think tank, dismisses the need for decarbonization entirely, calling scientific research, quote, climate delusion, whose purpose is nothing more than, quote, ever more intrusive control over people's lives. Repeating this trope, the influential Fox News talk show host Sean Hannity regularly characterizes climate scientists as, quote, climate cult alarmists, who have fabricated global heating as a huge Trojan horse for big government socialism. It may seem as if the accusation that climate scientists are alarmist cult leaders would have nothing to do with reality-based climate discourse, certainly not with the public speech of climate advocates or climate scientists themselves. But in the language of climate politics, No neat partisan divide separates the people accusing advocates and scientists of alarmism.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?